Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series on the Great Depression. I'm going to be talking about 1930, 1931, and 1932. I'm going to talk about what happened, the Great Depression, what caused it, what the effects of it were, and, well, a little bit what caused it. All right, let's get into it. All right, so as the collapse of the stock market that I talked about in the last video is the trigger cause of a larger and broader economic meltdown. As 1929 turns into 1930, the economy is rapidly deteriorating. Now, economic deterioration was not necessarily a new thing. Since the early days of the Republic, the American economy has tended to go in what's called a boom-bust cycle, which means basically there are years of plenty and there are years of crisis. Up to this point in American history, though, the years of plenty have been long, and the years of crisis have been very short. And these previous crises, were typically called panics. The business panics of earlier times in American history, though, were typically very short and very limited in their scope. For example, there was a panic in the 1840s, I think. There were various others throughout the 19th century. There was a panic in 1907. But these panics, they typically lasted less than a year, and then boom, the economy is right back to rocking and rolling again. Not so this time. The economic slowdown is very broad, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Now, President of the United States at the time is Herbert Hoover. He was a Republican. He had been elected in 1928. He won the presidency in the 1928 presidential election. Herbert Hoover was one of our country's wealthiest presidents. He was personally wealthy. He was a billionaire. He made his money as a CEO of a mining corporation before he became president. He had no prior experience in politics. He did not take his salary while he was president because he was already independently wealthy, or rather he didn't keep his salary, he donated it to charity. President Hoover gets a really bad rap typically when we're talking about the Great Depression. Everybody tends to paint Hoover as somebody who just sat and did nothing as the economy collapses around him. Actually, though, that's not quite right. But Hoover didn't sit and do nothing. The problem was, though, that what Hoover did, honestly, was in some ways, at best, it was ineffective. And at worst, it was actually worse than nothing. So it's not true that he sat and did nothing. He did do some things. But what he did do either didn't help or actually made things worse. All right, now what did Hoover do? As the economy gets worse and worse and things are unraveling, Hoover, he does really three main things. First of all, remember, the president's not a dictator. He can't make laws all by himself. He has to cooperate with Congress. So Hoover goes to Congress, and he convinces Congress to pass a law creating a new organization called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Reconstruction here should not be confused with the era of Reconstruction after the Civil War. This is not connected to that. This is different. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was not actually a business, despite the fact that it has the word corporation in the title. It was a government bureaucracy, and its job was to lend money to businesses and organizations and banks that needed it. However, it was much too little and way too late, and it wasn't nearly big enough, it didn't move fast enough, it didn't have the funds to really make much of an impact, so it didn't really do anything to actually help. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, probably the biggest thing they did was they provided the financing for the construction of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge in California. But, whoop-de-doo, that wasn't, building a single bridge is hardly going to fix the economy. I'm sure the people who got paid to help build that bridge were happy, but it was hardly going to fix the broader economy. Another thing that Hoover did was he went and he talked to business leaders he talked to business leaders, and he politely asked them to please not fire people. Well, yeah, that didn't do much. They fired whoever they had to fire to try to keep their businesses from going out of business. And then the third thing that Hoover did was, and this is more Congress's fault than Hoover's, but Hoover was culpable too. Congress came up with the brilliant idea of passing a tariff, which was called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Isn't that a wonderful name? Named after the congressman whose brilliant idea it was. That was sarcastic. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, but Hoover was responsible too because he signed the thing. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was a protectionist tariff. What that means is that the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a tariff is a tax on imports and exports. In this case, it was a tax on imports of various types of materials, primarily from Europe. The idea is that if there's a steep tax on imports from Europe, then imports from Europe will be more expensive, which means that people will be encouraged to buy American, which means that then, because people are buying American, it will help American companies. At least that was the idea behind it. However, it totally backfired. It did not work at all the way that they expected it would. The Smoot-Hawley tariff had two absolutely terrible effects. Terrible effect number one was that it started a trade war. A trade war is not actual shooting, but rather it means that other countries retaliate by passing their own tariffs. So all the European countries did the exact same thing. They passed tariffs that put steep taxes on imports from America. Well, that hurt the retaliatory tariffs from Europe hurt American companies more than the Smoot-Hawley tariff helped them. So American companies, their ability to export goods to Europe was completely destroyed because the American goods were now taxed so steeply that nobody could afford them. And so nobody in Europe wanted to buy American goods anymore. And so that just destroyed American business that much more. And so then lots of American businesses were going out of business because nobody in Europe would buy their goods anymore. That was terrible effect number one. Terrible effect number two was the effect that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had on companies in Europe. The European companies had the same problem. Their exports to America were taxed so steeply that nobody in America could afford to buy them, and so companies in Europe started going out of business. That, in turn, caused a bank panic in Europe, and basically, thanks to the Smoot-Hawley tariff and the tariff war, the Great Depression was no longer limited just to America, it spread to Europe too. So, good job there, Hoover administration. Instead of fixing the Great Depression, they made it worse and they sent it to Europe as well, and then Europe was just as bad off as we were. And kind of caused World War II also. But I'll get to that later. Alright. So, the Hoover administration didn't just sit and do nothing. They did respond to the Depression, but the response either was ineffective in the case of talking to business leaders and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or worse than nothing in the case of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which actually hurt the businesses that was supposed to help and was responsible for spreading the Depression to Europe. Alright, I'm going to do another video on the effects of the Depression in America. See you later.